The Duke of Thornbury told his wife she was nothing but a burden on a night he would spend the rest of his life regretting, and ordered her from his house in a fury he fully intended to take back by morning, the same way he had taken back a dozen smaller cruelties across 6 years of marriage, certain, with the comfortable, careless assumption of a man who had never once had reason to doubt it, that she would still be there waiting when his temper finally cooled. He woke the following day to an empty house and a wife who had already gone, and it would take him considerably longer than a single morning, and considerably more than a simple apology, to understand precisely what he had actually done. Before we get into how it started, this is a brand new channel, and if you love watching a proud man learn, far too late, exactly what he took for granted, hit subscribe now so you don't miss whether he manages to earn it back. Now, here's how it began. Edmund Blackwood, Duke of Thornbury, had married Helena Marsh 6 years earlier, in a match that had, by the standards of their circle, been considered a genuine love match, rather than the purely strategic arrangement most of their peers entered into. The two of them having met at a country assembly during Edmund's first season, managing the estate he'd inherited unexpectedly young, and fallen into an easy, genuine affection that had, for the first 2 years of their marriage, made Thornbury a considerably warmer and happier household than either of their own childhood homes had ever managed to be. Edmund remembered with a particular fondness that made the years that followed considerably harder to bear in comparison, the early months of their marriage, evenings spent reading aloud to one another in the small back parlour, while the rest of the great house sat quiet around them. Helena's habit of teasing him mercilessly over his terrible singing voice whenever he attempted to hum along with whatever tune she played on the pianoforte, the particular, easy laughter that had once filled Thornbury's halls so readily that the older servants, accustomed to the old Duke's cold, formal household, had remarked more than once on how considerably the whole estate seemed to have brightened since the new mistress's arrival. It was the slow, accumulating weight of the years that followed, rather than any single catastrophic event, that gradually eroded the warmth of those early years into something considerably more brittle, a marriage still outwardly affectionate, but increasingly strained beneath the surface by pressures neither Edmund nor Helena had fully learned how to share honestly with one another. The estate Edmund had inherited from his own father carried debts considerably more severe than he had understood at the time of his inheritance. The old Duke, having spent his final years quietly mortgaging land and borrowing against future rents to maintain an appearance of prosperity that had never once matched the estate's actual, deteriorating finances. Edmund discovered the full scope of the inherited debt only gradually, across his first several years as Duke, each fresh discovery landing with a fresh wave of private, humiliated anxiety that he found himself, with increasing frequency, unable to share honestly with his own wife, having absorbed, somewhere in his own upbringing, a rigid conviction that a man's financial troubles were his burden alone to carry, and that confessing the true depth of them to Helena would only frighten and burden her unnecessarily. There was, layered atop that quiet financial strain, a second and considerably more painful pressure that neither of them spoke of easily, even between themselves, the absence, across 6 years of marriage, of the heir that both their families and their own private hopes had long since expected them to produce. Helena had suffered, in the marriage's 3rd year, a miscarriage that had nearly cost her own life alongside the child's, arriving unexpectedly in her 5th month after what had seemed, until that point, an entirely ordinary and hopeful confinement. Edmund had sat outside her rooms for the better part of 2 days, while the physicians worked to save her, understanding, in the raw, terrified hours of that vigil, precisely how close he had come to losing her entirely, and had wept, alone in his own study, once the immediate danger finally passed, with a grief he had never once permitted himself to show her directly in the years since, believing, in his own rigid way, that his own visible sorrow would only compound whatever guilt she already carried over the loss. It was a loss both of them grieved deeply and separately, each retreating, in the raw aftermath, into a private grief that somehow never quite found its way into honest conversation between them, and the physicians consulted in the years since had offered little beyond vague, unhelpful reassurances that left both Edmund and Helena privately, silently convinced, in their darker moments, that the fault must somehow lie with themselves. Edmund's own formidable aunt, Lady Constance, a woman who had appointed herself the family's unofficial keeper of dynastic expectation since the old duke's death, made her disappointment in the marriage's continued childlessness known with a regularity that wore steadily at Edmund's own composure, her pointed remarks over family dinners growing sharper with each passing year. And Edmund, rather than defending his wife against his aunt's cruelty, as he ought to have done from the very first instance, had instead absorbed the criticism silently, letting it curdle, over time, into a private, unexamined resentment he did not fully recognize in himself until the night it finally erupted. There was a particular dinner, some months before the night that finally broke them, when Lady Constance had remarked, in front of several assembled guests, that it seemed a great pity Thornbury's nursery should sit empty so many years running, and wondered aloud, with a cruelty dressed carefully in polite concern, whether the Duchess had consulted any physicians of genuine reputation on the matter, or whether she simply preferred, for reasons of her own, to leave the succession in such precarious doubt. Helena had gone very pale and very quiet, and Edmund, mortified and furious in equal measure, but unwilling to create a scene in front of guests, had said nothing beyond a stiff, inadequate change of subject, a failure he would only fully recognize, months later, as one small brick in the wall that had slowly risen between himself and his wife. That night arrived in the marriage's 6th year, following a visit from the family's solicitor that delivered, in careful, devastating detail, the news that a final creditor's demand, considerably larger than any Edmund had previously managed to quietly settle, now threatened the estate's continued solvency entirely. A crisis considerably more severe than anything Edmund had faced across his years of careful, private management, and one he had, in his old rigid habit of shouldering every burden alone, never once mentioned to Helena at all, leaving her to learn the full gravity of their situation only in the moment the solicitor's grim assessment was finally, unavoidably delivered in her own hearing. The solicitor departed within the hour, leaving husband and wife alone in the study, with the full weight of the news settling over the room, like a physical presence. Helena, watching her husband's composure crack entirely under the weight of a crisis he had apparently been carrying alone for months without a single word to her, asked him, gently and with genuine concern, rather than any accusation, why he had never once trusted her enough to share the burden of it, a question that landed, in Edmund's already raw and humiliated state, with considerably more force than she had ever intended. "How long," she asked quietly, "have you known the situation was this severe?" "Nearly a year," Edmund admitted, the words coming out clipped and defensive, even as some part of him understood how poorly that admission would land. "I did not see the purpose in troubling you with figures you could do nothing to change. I might have done a great many things, had you trusted me enough to try," Helena said, her own composure beginning to fray at the edges. "I might have economized the household further. I might have written to my own father, whose connections in trade might have offered some manner of assistance. Instead, I have spent a year believing our situation considerably more stable than it apparently was, while you carried the whole of it alone and said nothing." He turned on her with a fury that surprised them both. Years of accumulated financial anxiety and Lady Constance's relentless criticism and his own private, unexamined grief over their childlessness, all tangling together into a single, devastating outburst that he would spend the rest of his life wishing, with his whole heart, he could take back. "Trust you," Edmund said, his voice rising with a bitterness that had been building, unacknowledged, for years. "I have spent 6 years protecting you from every burden this estate has forced upon me, Helena, precisely because I understood you had already given this family quite enough, having failed to give it the single thing it most required of you. I have carried the debts alone. I have carried my aunt's endless disappointment alone. I have carried the whole weight of a marriage that has given me nothing but a wife I cannot even properly provide for. and I find I am simply exhausted tonight of carrying it all in silence while you ask me why I never shared the burden with a woman who has become nothing but a burden herself." The silence that followed those words stretched long enough that Edmund, even in the raw grip of his own fury, understood almost immediately the enormity of what he had just said, watching the color drain entirely from Helena's face, watching 6 years of careful, patient devotion crumble behind her eyes into something he had never once seen there before, a cold, final, unreachable distance. "Leave my sight," he said, the words tumbling out in the same reckless, wounded fury, "and do not return to it until I have decided I am prepared to see you again." He expected, storming from the room himself, rather than waiting for any response, that Helena would retreat to her own rooms for the night, as she had done after smaller quarrels across their 6 years together, and that he would find her there in the morning, ready to accept the apology he already knew, even in the depths of his own fury, he would owe her by daylight. He woke instead to a house unnaturally quiet, and it was his own valet, hesitant and clearly uncomfortable delivering the news, who informed him that the Duchess had ordered her own carriage packed before dawn and departed for her childhood home some 60 miles distant, taking with her only her personal belongings and leaving behind a single, brief note that Edmund found waiting on his own writing desk, sealed and formal in a manner that struck him, reading it, as considerably more final than anything he had genuinely prepared himself to receive. The note itself was brief, and considerably more devastating for its restraint than any lengthy accusation might have been. "You have finally said plainly what I believe you have felt for some years," Helena had written. "I will not remain in a house where my presence is understood as a burden rather than a partnership. I wish you every success in resolving the estate's difficulties, and I release you from any further obligation to consider my own comfort in the arrangements you make going forward." Edmund rode for her family's estate within the hour, fully expecting that a single sincere apology, delivered in person, would be sufficient to undo the damage of a single terrible night, and arrived to find Helena's own father, a mild-mannered baronet who had always regarded his son-in-law with genuine warmth, considerably cooler in his reception than Edmund had ever once experienced from the man, informing him, with a careful, formal courtesy, that made plain the baronet's own loyalties had shifted entirely toward his daughter's welfare, that Helena did not wish to receive him, and that he would ask the Duke to respect her wishes, rather than force the matter through any further insistence. Edmund returned to Thornbury in a state of genuine, disoriented shock, having genuinely never once considered, across 6 years of a marriage he had always privately believed unshakable, regardless of whatever tensions occasionally strained it, that a single terrible night might actually cost him the whole of it. The house itself seemed to mock him in her absence, every room carrying some small trace of her, the pianoforte gone silent in the front parlor, the particular chair by the library window where she liked to sit, with her needlework standing conspicuously empty each evening, and Edmund found himself, more nights than he cared to admit even to himself, sitting alone in that same library, simply staring at the empty chair, understanding with a fresh, sharp grief, each time precisely how thoroughly he had emptied the warmth from his own house, long before he ever spoke the words that finally emptied it of her as well. He wrote to Helena repeatedly, across the following weeks, each letter growing progressively more desperate and more genuinely remorseful, and received, in return, nothing beyond a single brief acknowledgement from her father, confirming the letters had been received, with no indication whatsoever that Helena herself had any intention of responding to them. It was nearly 2 months into that silence, a silence that forced Edmund into a reckoning with himself considerably more thorough than any single apology could have accomplished, that he finally began to understand, turning the whole of their 6 years together over with a new and painful honesty, precisely how much of the marriage's slow erosion had been his own doing rather than any single night's outburst. He had shouldered every burden of the estate alone, not out of genuine strength, but out of a rigid, inherited pride, that refused to let Helena be a genuine partner in anything beyond the household's ordinary, decorative management. He had let his aunt's cruel remarks about their childlessness go unanswered, time and again, rather than defend his wife with the fierce loyalty she had always deserved from him. He had, across 6 quiet years, gradually stopped confiding in her about anything of genuine consequence, building, without ever quite meaning to, exactly the sort of isolated, joyless marriage he had once believed himself too fortunate in love to ever risk creating. Helena, in that same span of silence, had not spent her months at her father's estate simply waiting in grief for whatever apology might eventually arrive. She had thrown herself, with a determined energy that surprised even her own father, into the modest management of his own estate's household accounts, discovering in herself a genuine talent for the work that 6 years of Thornbury's careful, decorative expectations of a duchess had never once given her the opportunity to exercise. She found, to her own considerable surprise, a quiet satisfaction in being asked her opinion and having it genuinely considered, in seeing the practical results of her own careful economies reflected directly in her father's improved accounts, and the discovery left her with a clarity about her own worth that made Edmund's letters, when they began arriving, considerably easier to read with a critical eye, rather than a purely wounded one. He resolved, in the aftermath of that painful reckoning, that he would not simply demand Helena's forgiveness through further letters or further insistent visits to her father's house, understanding, at last, that 6 years of accumulated neglect could not be undone by any single grand gesture, however sincere. He set himself instead to the slower, considerably harder work of actually becoming, in practice rather than merely in apology, the sort of husband he ought to have been from the very beginning. He confronted his aunt directly for the first time in years, finding her in her own sitting room and closing the door behind him with a deliberateness that told her immediately the conversation would not follow their usual comfortable pattern. "You will not speak of my wife's childlessness again, in my hearing or anyone else's," Edmund told her, his voice carrying none of its old deferential caution. "You have spent 6 years wounding her at my own table while I said nothing, and I understand now that my silence was every bit as cruel as your words. That silence ends today." Lady Constance, who had not been addressed in such terms by any member of her family in decades, drew herself up with considerable affront. "I have only ever spoken out of concern for this family's succession, Edmund. Someone must." "Then you may direct that concern toward me privately, if you must direct it anywhere at all," Edmund said, "and never again toward my wife, who has already suffered a loss in service of that succession that very nearly cost her own life, and received nothing from this family in return but your persistent, public disappointment. If you cannot manage that going forward, I will see to it you have considerably less occasion to dine at my table at all," he informed Lady Constance in terms that left no room for further ambiguity that any future remark regarding his wife's childlessness, or any suggestion that Helena's worth to the family depended upon it, would result in his aunt's own removal from any further involvement in Thornbury's affairs, a confrontation that left the formidable old woman genuinely startled and, in the weeks that followed, considerably more careful in her conduct than she had been in years. He undertook, with a thoroughness he had never previously applied to the task, a full and honest accounting of the estate's actual financial situation, working alongside his solicitors not to hide the difficulties from anyone any longer, but to address them directly. Selling off several parcels of land he had previously been too proud to part with, and restructuring the estate's remaining debts on considerably more sustainable terms, a painful but necessary process that left Thornbury genuinely, if modestly, more secure than it had been in years. It was nearly 4 months after Helena's departure that Edmund finally received a letter written in her own hand rather than her father's, brief and cautious, but genuinely her own voice for the first time since that terrible night, informing him that she had heard, through her own family's connections, of the changes he had apparently been making at Thornbury, and that she would be willing to receive a single visit from him, provided he understood it committed her to nothing further beyond the conversation itself. Edmund rode for her father's estate with a considerably more careful, humbled bearing than his first desperate journey had carried, and found Helena waiting for him in her father's own modest garden, composed and guarded in a manner that told him plainly the 4 months apart had done nothing to soften the genuine hurt of that single terrible night, whatever careful changes he had since made in his own conduct. "I did not come to ask your forgiveness today," Edmund said, before she could speak first. "I understand. I have not yet earned the right to ask for it. I came only to tell you the truth of what I have finally understood these past 4 months, that I called you a burden on the single worst night of my own private failures, and that the accusation was never once true of you, Helena. It was true only of my own pride, which refused for 6 years to let you carry anything alongside me, and which then, in a single terrible moment, blamed you for a weight I had never once actually permitted you to help me bear." Helena regarded him for a long moment, her composure carefully maintained, despite the evident cost of maintaining it. "Do you know," she said, "what I have thought most, these 4 months, whenever I turned that night over in my mind? Not the word itself, though it wounded me considerably. I thought of every smaller moment across 6 years that led to it. Every evening you retreated to your study, rather than telling me what troubled you. Every dinner your aunt insulted me, and you said nothing at all. You built an entire marriage in which I was permitted to manage your household and grace your table and grieve, silently, whatever losses came our way, but never once permitted to actually stand beside you in anything that genuinely mattered. I do not believe, Edmund, that a single terrible night created that pattern. I believe it simply gave you the words to finally say plainly what 6 years of silence had already made abundantly clear." "You are entirely right," Edmund said, "and I do not know how to undo 6 years of that pattern in a single conversation, nor do I expect you to trust that I have genuinely changed simply because I have said so today. I have confronted my aunt. I have restructured the estate's debts honestly, rather than hiding them. I intend, if you are ever willing to return to Thornbury, to include you in every decision of consequence the estate requires from this day forward, not because I believe it will erase what I said to you, but because I have finally understood that a partnership withheld for 6 years cannot be repaired by anything less than genuinely, consistently offering it going forward, for as long as it takes you to believe it." Helena was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression that had, for the first time since his arrival, softened by some small but genuine degree. "I will not return to Thornbury on the strength of a single conversation," she said, "but I find I am willing to allow you to write to me, honestly, about the estate's actual affairs, rather than the careful, edited version you have shared with me for 6 years, and I will judge, over whatever time that correspondence requires, whether the man writing those letters is genuinely different from the one who sent me away." Edmund agreed, and spent the following months writing to her with a thoroughness and honesty he had never once extended to her across the whole of their marriage, sharing every genuine difficulty the estate's recovery presented alongside its small, hard-won successes, and Helena, reading those letters with a careful, gradually thawing attention, began responding in kind. First with brief, practical replies, and then, as the months passed, with letters that carried increasingly genuine warmth, her own sharp, thoughtful observations on the estate's affairs proving, time and again, considerably more insightful than Edmund had ever once given her credit for, across 6 years, of deliberately excluding her from exactly this sort of consequential conversation. There was one exchange, some months into that long correspondence, that Edmund would keep among his own private papers for the rest of his life. He had written to her, in some frustration, about a tenant dispute over grazing rights that had proven considerably more complicated than his own steward's initial assessment suggested. And Helena had written back within the week with a solution drawn from a similar dispute she recalled her own father resolving years earlier. A solution so plainly sensible once suggested that Edmund felt something between embarrassment and genuine wonder at how thoroughly he had spent 6 years failing to ask for exactly this kind of help. He wrote back thanking her, and admitted in the same letter that he was beginning to understand precisely how much of their marriage's early happiness had depended on treating each other as genuine equals, a habit he had somehow, gradually and without ever meaning to, let slip away entirely once the weight of the dukedom settled fully onto his own shoulders alone. It was nearly a full year after that terrible night that Edmund finally asked her, in a letter rather than in person, understanding by then precisely how much she valued the honesty distance had somehow made easier between them, whether she might consider returning to Thornbury not as a burden restored to her old decorative place, but as a genuine partner in whatever years remained to them. And Helena, who had spent that year building a quiet, independent competence in her father's own household affairs that she had genuinely come to value, wrote back that she would return, on the condition that the partnership he now offered proved, in daily practice rather than merely in careful correspondence, to be everything his letters across that long year had promised it would be. She returned to Thornbury that spring, and the marriage that resumed bore only a surface resemblance to the one that had nearly ended a year earlier, filled now with the genuine, difficult, entirely worthwhile habit of two people who had finally learned to carry their burdens together rather than in the isolated, silent pride that had once nearly cost them everything. Lady Constance, informed of the Duchess's return and wisely choosing not to test the new terms of her own conduct within the household, offered Helena a stiff but genuine welcome that fell considerably short of warmth, but fell equally short, for the first time in years, of any cruelty either. And it was some months later, at a family dinner, Edmund watched with careful attention, that his aunt, quite unprompted, remarked to Helena on how considerably well the estate's accounts appeared to be managed of late, a compliment Edmund understood, coming from that particular source, as close to a genuine apology as Lady Constance was ever likely to offer. Edmund never again let a single burden of the estate's affairs go unspoken between them, and understood, watching Helena take her place beside him at the very desk where his solicitors had once delivered the news that broke them apart, now reviewing the quarter's accounts together with an ease that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, that whatever years remained to their marriage would need to be built, deliberately and continuously, on exactly the honest partnership he had once believed too burdensome to offer at all. The pianoforte in the front parlour found its music again that same spring, and the old servants who had once remarked on how thoroughly the house had brightened at Helena's original arrival found themselves, quietly, and with considerable relief, making the very same observation a second time. If watching a proud man learn precisely what he threw away, and precisely what it actually took to earn it back, left you satisfied, you know exactly what to do. This channel is brand new, and every subscriber genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this one. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the next release. Give this one a like if you think Helena was right to make him earn it through an entire year, rather than a single apology. Share it with someone who loves a story about rebuilding trust, the slow, honest way, and let me know in the comments whether you'd have gone back at all.